All right, good afternoon and welcome. As you know, my name is Dan Andrews and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Law School. It's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome all of you and to introduce our special speaker. Before I do, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Brendan Brown Lecture Series, which began at our law school back in 1982. Brendan Brown was the 6th dean of our law school, and he was an internationally recognized legal scholar. And the series that's named in his honor invites distinguished professionals from around the United States, various different fields, who've made a contribution to public life to share their perspectives with us on a wide variety of current topics. Our special guest today is Cornell William Brooks, who is the 18th president and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP. President Brooks earned his BA degree at Jackson State University, a Master of Divinity degree from Boston University, and a JD degree from Yale University, where I just learned he was a classmate of Professor Selecki. He's had a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney, social justice advocate, ordained minister, and coalition builder. In his professional career, he's had a wide variety of positions. He was a law clerk to Chief Judge Sam Ervin on the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. He served as a staff attorney for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law, as executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Greater Washington, as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, as a special and senior counsel at the Federal Communications Commission, and as president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And now, of course, he leads the NAACP. President Brooks will speak to us today on the topic of the ballot and the testament. We are very fortunate that he is willing to share his expertise and his thoughts with us. Please join me in welcoming President Brooks.
Good afternoon. As a young lawyer, recent graduate of law school, I moved to a rather nondescript apartment not too far from here on Channing Street. So I would walk past this very well-appointed campus, see my little hovel, and think to myself, it would be nice to live closer to Catholic University. So I've made it here after all these years. First of all, I'd just like to express a word of appreciation to the chair of the board, who was kind enough to extend an invitation to the dean. I also want to thank the hospitality of, I believe, 2 students, Emily and Rachel, who extended to me a great deal of graciousness and hospitality. I also want to thank all of you for being here for this lecture series. Now, this being Catholic University and this distinguished law school, I hope you won't mind if I begin with a funny but true story. Now, the dean mentioned that I am a 4th generation ordained minister, or you may have. And I have to tell you that as a minister and as a trial attorney, it's not always been my good fortune to be in the midst of such a distinguished group of people. So in fact, I can think of a time many years ago, I found myself in London, England, standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral as a seminarian preparing to go to law school. So I found myself outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral with these spires soaring up toward the heavens, these stained glass windows reflecting the iridescent, multicolored, multi-hued beauty of God. And as a young man, as a young preacher, I suppose that there were about 2,000 or so people inside waiting to hear this young, naive, presumptuous preacher preach. I made my way into the sanctuary and I immediately noticed the obvious. The pastor and exactly 2 members. One member I'll call Ms. Jones, the other member I'll call Ms. Smith. And I did as I was taught to do, which is to say that you preach, you speak, you share to two people in the same way that you would to 2,000. So I made my way into the pulpit, a rather ornate affair, a series of steps spiraling toward the heavens, and I began to preach. And I immediately noticed the obvious that the member I call Miss Jones immediately fell asleep. True story. Now, this only inspired me to preach, to speak, to share with greater fervor, with greater enthusiasm. And I noticed that the other member, whom I'll call Miss Smith, seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. She tapped her toes, she clapped her hands, she nodded her head. In affirmation, she said hallelujah and amen at all the right liturgical and theological moments. And I thought to myself, at least I'm reaching one somebody this Sunday morning. Well, I concluded my modest little homily, made my way to the side of the pastor. And the pastor said to me, Brother Brooks, I'm just so sorry. Miss Jones falls asleep on everyone. And Miss Smith is out of her mind and did not understand. So you can see why I'm just absolutely delighted to be here at Catholic University and in the midst of this distinguished group of law students. The topic that I'd like to lift up today might be simply described as the ballot and the testament. The ballot referring to the right to vote, and the testament referring to the body of work, the literature, if you will, of social justice represented in the history of the NAACP, a testament, in the words of James Washington, a testament of hope. When we look across the length and breadth of our republic, we find ourselves at an anguishing hour of democracy. We see a woke generation of millennial activists who are asserting with their minds, with their hearts, with their very bodies, in the words of William Shakespeare, now is the winter of our discontent. When we look across the length and breadth of our nation, we see grandmothers and grandfathers, grandchildren, all standing up for the right to vote. We look across our country and we take note of the fact that since Election Day, there have been no less than 1,000 hate crimes committed, taking place not in the main in bars or in streets, but in K through 12 schools, because the children, our children, are in fact imitating the bad conduct of their parents. It is a moment in American history when, in the wake of the election and re-election of the first African-American president and the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, we see nothing less than a Machiavellian frenzy of voter disenfranchisement. It is a moment in our nation's history where our conscience as a nation is shocked and pricked and pierced by the injustices that we see. It is a moment in our nation's history where we're asking ourselves, are we the country that our grandparents left for us and expect for us to be? Are we at a moment in this nation's history where the civil rights movement that we studied years ago as a part of the seemingly distant past is literally manifesting, materializing before our very eyes, with old racial demons that we thought we had buried, that we thought we exorcised from this republic, literally tormenting us as we speak. It is a moment in our nation's history where we are being asked, are we willing to step up? Are we willing to step forward? Are we willing to be the country we were meant to be? It is a moment in which the words of a former member of the executive board of directors of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and a first lady by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt, who declared in 1940, "These are no ordinary times." This is no ordinary time. It is a time in which Literally, the times of crying out, calling out to attorneys, to law students, to faculty. Will we step up and step forward and literally address the justice challenges of the moment? And so in the midst of this anguishing hour of our democracy, were we to turn the gilded pages of African American history, we might discern certain moral lessons, certain moral precepts that speak to our hearts, speak to our minds, and literally speak to these times. Principal among these figures of African American history stands a former member, or I should say a member of the executive committee of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, otherwise known as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He, if you read his scholarship, and this being a theologian's oasis, Catholic University, you might discern in the social ethic and the moral theology of Dr. King 3 lessons that I'd like to lift up. The first of which is the intrinsic value of human beings. The intrinsic value, the innate self-worth of human beings. The second of which is this notion of interdependence. And the third of which is that there is a moral order to the universe. When we talk about the intrinsic value of human beings, this is no academic question. This is no analytic plaything. It is something that is very real that we're wrestling with as a society. When we think about the fact that we are in the midst of this era of mass incarceration, 2.2 million Americans behind bars, 70 million Americans with a criminal record, 1 million fathers behind bars, literally a generation of our children who have been orphaned as a consequence of our overinvestment in prisons and underinvestment in schools and colleges. It is a moment in which our criminal justice system is reducing to a state of nothingness a large swath of our citizenry and our humanity. When I spent time as the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, I literally spent hours, days, months working on this challenge called prisoner reentry. And when I tell you, it does something to the soul, it does something to the heart to see somebody emerge from prison, less of a human being, less of a man, less of a woman than when they first entered the criminal justice system. I'm reminded of a story of a law enforcement officer in Alabama who, while searching through the bottom of a rusty file cabinet, came across 2 sepia-tone pictures of yesteryear, 2 black and white photographs of a time gone by. He found these photographs at the bottom of this file cabinet. The first photograph depicted a young man with a precocious sense of moral gravitas and a ministerial bearing. And yet, beneath this young man's picture were these numbers: 7089, 7089. The second picture depicted a woman of middle age whose countenance reflected a certain beauty and brilliance, but also a fierce sense of determination. And yet, defacing that picture like the grime of graffiti on a wall were these numbers: 7063, 7063. We don't know the young man by his mugshot number. We don't know the young man by his criminal record number. We know him by his given name, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We don't know the middle-aged woman by her mugshot number, by her criminal record number. We know her by the name the school children the world over know her, Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks. In other words, our humanity cannot be reduced to our mugshot numbers. to our criminal record numbers. Our humanity cannot be stripped away by the dehumanizing treatment of our criminal justice system. This, for me, is not a sociological observation, but also a matter of some modest personal experience. Only a few weeks ago, I found myself in Mobile, Alabama, engaged in a modest act of civil disobedience against a United States senator nominated to become the Attorney General of these United States. We sat in his office, and as a consequence of sitting in his office, being charged with criminal trespass, being booked, fingerprinted, and cuffed, and taken to the Mobile County Jail, and then having our mugshots taken. And what I discovered is that your mugshots in Alabama are then put online and made available as a predicate, a premise, if you will, for profit. So not only did our mugshots show up in the New York Times and on CNN and online, but also in our local tabloids, mugshot tabloids sold in grocery stores near you. This is a system designed to strip away the humanity of our fellow citizens. And so when we as attorneys, when we as social justice advocates advocate for policies like ban the box, that take away that box that puts forward the seemingly innocuous inquiry, have you ever been arrested and convicted of a crime, to allow people to compete for work, we're literally affirming human dignity, affirming self-worth, and affirming the intrinsic value of human beings. Why? This kind of advocacy, this kind of criminal justice reform is predicated on the notion that if a man has paid his debt to society with the hard currency of responsibility, he deserves a second chance, particularly if he never had much of a first chance. It is predicated on the notion that a woman never loses her humanity no matter how long she is behind bars. We are at a moment in our history as a nation where literally, we are stripping away the humanity of our fellow citizens, and the times call for us to do something about it. It means addressing the challenge of sentencing reform, currently before the House and the Senate. Many of us have lived through these draconian drug laws, these mandatory minimums that have literally robbed children of their parents, literally robbed communities of productive citizens, literally robbed people of that sense of possibility that life offers when your eyes are open and dreams reside in the heart. This is a moment where the moral precepts and the teachings of Dr. King literally reverberate and echo with relevance in these times. He taught, based on the moral philosophy of Boston personalism, that each of us has value. No matter where you come from, no matter your hue or your heritage, no matter how wealthy you are, no matter how poor you are, no matter how well or ill educated you are, you have value. Now, this is not merely a matter for those who are wrapped up in the criminal justice system. This is also a matter that we can ponder as a society as we speak, particularly when America is not faced with a choice between liberalism and conservatism, but rather authoritarianism and democracy, where we face a set of government policies, policy choices, and policy direction that literally put our civil rights and civil liberties at risk, and as such, imperil human dignity. When you deploy a refugee ban, an immigrant ban, a Muslim ban, leaving people stranded at the airport, it's not merely a matter of who gets in, who's able to stay, who's able to enjoy the freedoms that this country offers. It's also a matter of who's denied a recognition and an appreciation of their humanity. In other words, when any of us is left vulnerable to torture or to human rights violations. Our collective dignity is imperiled. The second lesson that Dr. King lifted up was this notion of a moral order to the universe. You recall that he said well and often that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This is a moment in our country where so many may be triggered toward a state of clinical depression. You read your Twitter feed, you watch the news, you read the newspapers, and there may be a temptation to slip into a state of despair. But may I remind you that Dr. King believed that wrong is wrong, right is right, but also that wrong could be made right. When we think about the state of voting rights in this country, some may be tempted to despair. But may I remind you of the sacrifices many have made for us to enjoy the franchise today. May I remind you that Dr. King and a group of freedom fighters attempted to cross a somewhat obscure bridge in a relatively small town called Selma. They did so in 1965. History tells us that the Voting Rights Act is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. History tells us that the Voting Rights Act was signed into law with 40 some odd ceremonial pens wielded by the hand of the President Lyndon Baines Johnson. But history also tells us that that law was enacted with the blood, sweat, and tears of members of the NAACP. So don't tell me what we can't do when we make up our minds as a country to do it. So this is not a moment to despair. This is not a moment to give up. This is not a moment to let ourselves down. This is a moment to understand, to fully appreciate that hope is not a moral luxury. It is, in fact, a moral necessity. This is precisely the moment when we have to believe in our capacity to affect change. This is precisely the moment for us to believe in what we can do as lawyers, as law students, as faculty, as a law school. This is precisely the moment for us to believe in the possibilities, the promise of our country, based not merely on the challenges of the present, but also on the performance of our fellow citizens in the past. Now, lest you think that this is about 1965. Let's consider where we are in the wake of the election and re-election of the nation's first African-American president, the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act. In the wake of the Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court decision, in which we have seen nothing less than a Machiavellian frenzy of voter disenfranchisement from one end of the country to the other. In Texas, they passed a voter suppression law predicated on the myth of the need for a government-issued photo ID, or predicated on the notion or the myth of voter fraud. They passed a law which said that if you have a concealed weapon permit, it was deemed sufficient civic and democratic proof to vote. But if you possess an ID which allowed you to carry a book of English, a book of engineering, a book of chemistry, a book of Shakespeare, a college textbook deemed to be insufficient civic and democratic proof to vote. Over in the state of North Carolina, an ID which allows you to walk across the campus of Camp Lejeune or Fort Bragg, that ID was deemed sufficient civic and democratic proof to vote under that omnibus voter suppression law. But an ID which allows you to walk across the campus of North Carolina A&T, North Carolina State University, or Duke University deemed to be insufficient civic and democratic proof to vote. Over in the state of North Carolina, we saw a rollback of early voting. We saw a rollback, if you will, of all the measures which allow more people to participate and to exercise the franchise. But what have we seen? We have literally seen citizens linking arms, joining hands with attorneys and going to court and prevailing. The NAACP, in less than 10 months, secured court victories against voter suppression in the Fourth Circuit and in the Fifth Circuit. We note that in the Fourth Circuit, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit declared that the state legislature engaged in intentional racial discrimination with respect to voter suppression carried out with surgical precision. We literally put back into play 5% of the electorate, 5% of the votes we put back into play. And on the eve of the election, we caught our undemocratic, small d democratic, opponents engaged in literally stealing voter registrations on the eve of the election. And in the Fifth Circuit, in Texas, we went to court and literally put 630,000 ballots back into play. Now, we're not talking merely about well-equipped, well-educated attorneys, but also grassroots people working hand in hand to protect the franchise. Why? Because they understand that the ballot box is not colored the red, white, and blue of those I voted stickers, but rather literally colored the blood, sweat, and tears of the members of the NAACP. We believe that the right to vote is a civic sacrament being desecrated in the temple of our democracy as we speak, and we are prepared to literally lay down our lives for that which our forebears gave us. We believe that there's a moral order to the universe. Can I tell you, it's even deeper than that. In the summer of 2015, we met in Selma, Alabama. The NAACP purposed within its heart to march from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., a geographic span of 1,002 miles over the course of 43 days, beginning in 103 heat, with the pavement being 109 degrees, heat index of 113 degrees. When we met in Selma at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, I met a man by the name, the chosen name of Middle Passage. Middle Passage was 67 years of age, a veteran of the Navy, a veteran of the Vietnam War. And when I met him at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he told me he wanted to walk all the way from Selma, Alabama to Washington, D.C., across 2 red states, 2 purple states, and into 1 blue District of Columbia for the right to vote. When I met him, he's not only told me he wanted to walk the entire distance, but he wanted to carry the American flag. And so we walked for 40 days in the heat, in the sun, and in the rain. And we came to a little place called Spotsylvania, Virginia. We walked through a rainstorm. And in the rainstorm, Middle kept the flag wrapped up. But when the sun parted, when the clouds parted, when the blue sky emerged, Middle unfurled the flag, and when he did so, he literally collapsed to the pavement. My hardest day at the NAACP was telling a group of school children, a group of students, that Middle didn't make it, that he didn't come back from the hospital, that he died. But the hardest question I've ever been asked at the NAACP was posed by those school children who asked this question: if a man was willing to die for the right to vote, why can't we vote and fight for the right to vote? That's the moment we're in. There's a moral order to the universe. And I'm convinced when we look across this country and we see people who believe in their capacity to affect change, when 500,000 women of every age and every generation gathered in the nation's capital, they did not gather to pay homage to cynicism. They did not gather to pay homage to a kind of patriotic pessimism. They gathered because they believed in their capacity to be agents of change. They gathered because intuitively they sensed that there's a moral order to the universe and that wrong is wrong, right is right, but wrong can be made right. That's the moment that we're in. But can I share with you? This is a moment for lawyers. Because here's what I've seen in this modest work in the association. I came to the NAACP a week before Eric Garner lost his life in Staten Island. A few weeks before Michael Brown lost his life in Ferguson. Not too distant from the time an Afro-angelic little boy by the name of Tamir Rice lost his life in Cleveland. Not too distant from a time when a young woman declined to put out her cigarette in the midst of a routine traffic stop, found herself in jail, and she thereafter lost her life. Sandra Bland. Not too distant from a time when Jamar Clark lost his life. Not too distant from a time in which 9 students of Scripture were assassinated in a church. It's been a difficult time, but one of the things that I'm convinced of is this is a moment where lawyers need to stand in the gap. Why? Because in Ferguson, only one point of accountability with respect to the loss of Michael Brown's life, where a young man was laid to rest with bullets in his body lying on the pavement for 4 hours. And yet young people, millennials, with their devices, with their cell phones, literally teleported his image around the world, and literally put the words Michael Brown on the lips of Barack Obama in Geneva, Switzerland. But lawyers played a critical role. Why? Because the officer who killed Michael Brown, not held accountable, but that Ferguson Police Department, subject to a pattern and practice investigation, subject to a pattern and practice report, subject to a pattern and practice settlement, brought by lawyers, effectuated by lawyers, at a place where I used to work and that I revere, the United States Department of Justice. But there's a relationship between lawyers and layfolk. Why? Because Eric Holder was able to mount the evidence based on statistics dictated by a statute that lay people wrote through the NAACP. We need everybody in this fight. It's a multi-generational fight. And here we come to the third precept here. Interdependence. We need each other. I know this is a moment where we've been told that you have Muslims, you have Jews, you have Catholics, you have Protestants, you have Northerners and Southerners, and you have big city folks and small town folks, conservatives and liberals, and that we should all live in our atomized cells of independence. But Dr. King taught us that we are in fact bound together. You recall the scholarship of Kimberly Crenshaw. You recall this notion of intersectionality. The intersectionality of oppression, intersectionality of bias and bigotry. But beside this notion of intersectionality is this notion of interdependence. This notion that we need each other, that we depend on each other, that we have to rely on each other. That applies to everybody. It applies to lawyers and lay people, but it also applies to those who are millennials and those of the Motown era. And so for those of you under 35, I ask that you stop listening so that I can just talk to the folks who are over 35. You cannot outsource this civil rights movement to the millennial generation. You cannot watch it on television and say we did what we did back when we could do it. Because we are literally watching a generation of our children being profiled as we speak. We are literally watching our franchise being stolen as we speak. We're literally watching our civil rights and our civil liberties being imperiled as we speak. It is a moment in which we have to come together. We are, in fact, interdependent. Generationally, racially, ethnically, and certainly in terms of sexual orientation and gender. We are dependent on one another. And if by chance, at this moment, in the midst of this African American History Month, where I'm told by the chief executive of this republic that Frederick Douglass yet lives, if by chance you're tempted to grow discouraged, may I remind you of these words, which are entombed on faded manuscript in the Bonneke Rare Book Library on the campus of Yale University, and yet written on the hearts of millions of members and supporters of the NAACP. The words would be these: lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on, let us march on, let us march on till victory is won.
I'm just telling our speaker, they usually don't get standing ovations. President Brooks would be happy to take a few questions.
In your opinion, what is the best way, and as millennials, that we should be looking at this problem and solving this? Many of us are going through law school now. We might not necessarily have the power to make immediate change. What are some steps that you think that we should be looking at implementing in order to try to correct the problems that we see arising?
So one of the things that I would take note of is your analytic skill set as law students. Right? The fact that you know how to do research, both in terms of policy and in terms of law, that you know how to bring together and put together teams of experts. So when a small branch of the NAACP is grappling with a change in voting, the fact that you have law students who understand the Voting Rights Act, who understand Section 5, who understand what a change in voting looks like. That you understand that if you move a polling place from a college campus, an HBCU, it has racially disparate consequences. These are the kinds of skills. The fact that you can write memos, incredibly important. When we talk about policing, it's one thing to launch a march demonstration, critically important. But it's also another thing to be able to analyze a racial profiling law and say that the best of these laws have these key features. So if you're looking to pass one with respect to your city or your state, here are the features that you should have in this law. We can connect you with a law firm. We can do research on this. That's critically important. These legal clinics are vital. I mean, I just want to emphasize, there are communities in which young people have literally had their lives saved, not merely by activists in the streets, but law students in the library. Critically important. That skill set is one, let me put it this way, once you leave Washington, You leave New York City or San Francisco, you hit the great hinterland, where there's not a law firm on every corner willing to do this kind of work. There aren't law students who are willing to do this kind of research. There aren't people who are able to say there's something you can do about this. Here are the federal agencies you should be in contact with. Here are the people who can offer some assistance. I can tell you that literally your skill set is critically important. Number two, the consciousness raising aspect of the work is very important here. So in other words, where the country has moved to the point of understanding that voter fraud is a myth and that voter suppression is real, that's a consequence of education. So you have people on the street who understand. I think I heard something about some group called the Brennan Center or something like that. I think I heard a study, 1 billion ballots cast, 32 fraudulent votes. The main problem we got in this country with voter fraud is not voter fraud by voters, but voter fraud by politicians. That's seeping into the public consciousness. When the president, no partisan commentary here, simply a legal and policy observation. When the president of the United States talked about voter fraud and the need to issue an executive order, and you have journalists calling him out on it immediately, so much so that the NAACP, we had to take our turn. A rare thing. But that's a consequence of literally advocacy, grassroots advocacy. Third point I lift up here is creating a fraternity or a sorority, if you will, of the committee. Networking among your colleagues, your classmates to bring about reform. Critically important, because I'll go back to my first point. Don't underestimate the degree to which your skill set is critically important right now. When I met a 17-year-old kid in Ferguson who said to me, I'm tired of getting tear gassed. Tell me what to do. He's looking to understand what's a racial profiling law. What does it mean to have a civilian review board with civilian power? What does it mean to have body cameras or dash cam cameras? How do you regulate the technology so that it comes with the training necessary to protect lives? What does community policing mean? These are the kinds of things that you can teach, even as law students, the kinds of things that you can communicate, and the kind of advocacy you can engage in. Yes, sir.
Sir, thank you for your insight. And could you tell me how, under a president who mocks individuals with disabilities, how can we who accept disabilities as inclusion in the United States, how can we strengthen their rights so that their rights not rolled back and they can have a good life as others?
Excellent question. I think one of the challenges that we're grappling with right now is a certain kind of philosophical terms, a kind of solipsism among the advocates. We're all talking in our own language among ourselves. You got the disability rights folks over here, you got the civil rights folks over here, civil liberties folks over here, women's rights, LGBTQ rights. We have to have that kind of intersectionality with respect to the language. We got to talk about disability rights as civil rights. And that means we also have to stand together when we talk about these rights. And so what I mean by that is when you had Steve Bannon take up an office of legitimacy in the White House, right, in the West Wing. It's important not only for the ADL to call it out, but the NAACP. When you have the president mocking people with disabilities who are differently able, we got to call that out. And you don't have to be in the disability rights community to do that. And so my point being is we really are at a moment where we cannot outsource the movement to specialists. And that's what we've done. And as a consequence, literally, we find ourselves at a moment in our nation's history where we have executive orders being issued seemingly by the hour, tweets by the moment, with everybody scrambling as to how to respond. as opposed to our making it clear we're not going to have the whole of our democracy collectively demeaned, either in part or in whole. And so there's specific things that obviously that we can do in terms of regulations, in terms of fair housing, fair employment. But I just want to fundamentally underscore that this is the kind of fight where literally we have to mobilize our advocates in very, very strategic ways, because there are too many things that can happen basically below the regulatory veil. It's not all about what happens in Congress, it's also about what happens in these agencies, and we gotta be sophisticated and thoughtful, and that means literally everybody having their eyes and ears on the ground.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I wondered if you'd comment on the role of privatizations of prisons and the corporate financial interest that's contributing to the whole idea of increasing incarceration rates and the impact on many communities within the country.
Excellent question, and let me answer it from the perspective of not just a national advocate, but a state practitioner. When I was in New Jersey, worked with the New Jersey State Conference of the NAACP, we passed prisoner reentry legislation that the New York Times called a model for the country, mandating in-prison education, mandating that people leaving prisons be reconnected to the healthcare system, coordinating training so that people will leave prison prepared to work and to pay taxes and assume lives of responsibility. But embedded in that legislation was a requirement that the state had to certify that when there was an empty bed in the private community houses, halfway houses, that they had to fill it. They had to certify the vacancy and fill it. So in other words, embedded in what we thought to be somewhat progressive legislation was an incentive to use these private prisons. We've seen it in terms of the interstate and intrastate phone charges, right? So in other words, you have basically private companies taking advantage of the phone charges to the families of prisoners. We saw it in the last administration where the administration made a determination that private prisons have a profit incentive to be filled. So the point being here is I think that there's a rising tide of awareness there, but there's too many states relying on private prisons in the juvenile justice context, in the adult context, and as a market, they're expanding to those who are undocumented. So in other words, it's not just that you're capturing, if you will, a market of domestic native-born prisoners, but also immigrants who are undocumented. And that these two things are occurring side by side and are mutually reinforcing from a market perspective. So one of the things that we found that's very helpful at the NAACP is to expose this and to make it clear that when we talk about the power of money in politics, it's not just in an academic sense, it's not just in a good government sense. It's about exposing the fact that the people who are paying off your state legislators are imprisoning your kids, and that these two things are related. And so the point being is to make the connections. When we make the connections, people accept our arguments, and they aren't able to ideologically typecast our arguments, i.e. it's those civil rights folks, it's those liberals, those progressives, as opposed to folks who are fiscally conservative, where these private prisons result in lawsuits, they result in lives being damaged, they result in bad policy. We have to call it out and literally seek friends and supporters across the ideological spectrum and be very strategic here. If not, we lose.
Time for any more questions?
I wonder, in follow-up to the first question, if you could tell us a bit about your own personal experience in law school and how you were able to balance your law school curriculum with pro bono clinic externships.
That is a good question. It has everything to do with not having slept in my 20s. I mean, I came to law school from seminary, and from having studied, Boston personalism and moral philosophy, and then going to contracts and torts and property. And for me, it was a very bewildering experience. But it affirmed my belief that the law was a tool for justice. And it affirmed my belief that one can engage in social justice ministry through the law. And so what I tried to do in terms of balance was, put the emphasis on the academics, trying to do the best I could, because I just thought that was incredibly important. And it may have had something to do with the fact that I didn't go to a particularly high-priced undergraduate college, and so I was a little insecure and kind of maybe overly driven. But getting past that, I really wanted to develop a strong analytic skill set. Okay? And so I used my summers, those internships, to position me to do the work that I hope to do, as trying to sneeze, as a civil rights lawyer. So I think those internships are key, number one. Number two, the mentorship of good professors, really, really key. Three, a senior partner at one of the firms in Atlanta said to me, it's important as a law student, don't just network like this, vertically, network horizontally. Because 15 years out of law school, you might not be able to reach the person who's 3 rungs above you. But you will always be able to reach your classmates. No matter how well they're doing, they always take your call. And I found that to be true. The greatest resource you have are your law professors, but don't underestimate the people sitting beside you. They're the folks who knew you when you didn't quite have it together. It's not true for anybody here. And these are the folks who, I'll put it this way, some of my classmates will recall when I graduated from law school and lived not too far from here. I was dating a wonderful lady who became my wife. And she came to visit me in my rather modest apartment, and she asked me, why is your cat eating Chinese food? I said, because the cat eats what I eat. We can't afford 2 menus. All of my classmates then, they always take my phone call. We've been through some things together.
Affection for you, thanks. It has our logo on it. So please be sure to take it out in the presence of anyone who might want to attend law school. So I hope you all will join us in the atrium and have a chance to say hello to President Brooks.